land that you gave us to grow our food on. So, Lord, help us this morning to understand how it operates, and especially our responsibilities that you gave us in Genesis 2:5 and 2:15. In Jesus' name we pray. Now, the first thing is you got to have a piece of ground. Okay? Now, people like buckets and stuff like that on a driveway, and that can be done too. I won't go into that, but we were given the responsibility in Genesis 2:5 to serve the ground. We were also given the responsibility in Genesis 2:15 to dress the garden and to keep it the way God designed it. Well, that word till the ground, till, in Genesis 2:5, and that word dress the garden, Genesis 2:15, are both the same Hebrew word used differently. And neither one of them are dress or till. The Hebrew word is a work of service. There was a work of service God gave us to do to the ground, and a work of service he gave us to do to the garden. And that work of service was to maintain in good condition the livestock in the ground. There is more by weight living organisms in the top 6 inches of an acre of ground than can be supported on the surface in cattle or other grazing animals. There is more life by weight in that top 6 inches of soil in the form of microbes. Their job is to fertilize all the vegetation growing on the planet. So we were given the responsibility to serve them. So we're going to be learning about the acts of service we're to do. Now, the garden design that God gave Adam and Eve was a specific design for their family's needs. It was different than the design that was in this land, Eden, which God brought them to and made for them a garden of Eden. Notice the garden of Eden, not the garden in Eden. It was in Eden, if you read in Genesis there, but it was called the Garden of Eden. The reason was Eden means pleasure, delight, delicate. So in the land of pleasure and delight, God created a garden of pleasure and delight, a garden design that was not there in the land of Eden, although it was a land of pleasure and delight. He gave them a specific design. And you can read in the book Education in page 22 where that design was to be duplicated by all the families and fill the whole earth with that garden design. So we have to look at things from the design that we were given, and we'll be probably focusing a little more on the service to the soil. But we want to remember, too, there is a service that we're to do to the landscape itself. You know, landscapers do the plantings and all those things to create garden designs. You think of Kew Gardens in England there, and Fairchild Garden in Miami, and Callaway Garden in Georgia. These are beautiful gardens that are famous in the world. And so God gave us a garden design, and we were to keep that design. So just to touch on that design just a bit, because I'm not going to go into it, that design is similar to what we call today companion planting. Different plants grow best with each other. And you can get an idea of that when you look at an ecosystem. If you get out your little science book there that the kids use at school, you know, in high school and whatever, and look at an ecosystem. I have a chestnut oak ecosystem on the ridge on our property. I also have a red maple swamp ecosystem. I also have a cattail marsh ecosystem, and there's a limited number of plants in these ecosystems, just like in our garden there's a limited number of plants, usually about 30 species or so, give or take 10, these are ecosystems, and they all grow in companion to each other. They assist and serve each other. So we, studying creation, are going to recognize that God has given us a role of service to the ground. It's called till in the King James, but they were scholars, and being scholars was necessary to write the King James Bible because they had to know how to take one language and convert it into another language. But they weren't country boys, so they didn't know how to interpret the word. And so they put, well, what do they do to the ground? Well, they tell it. Well, what do you do to a garden? You put on a side dressing. A farmer will side dress sometimes. If I see I don't have peas or beans all through the pod, but I have a couple misses, I know I have potassium deficiency. So I just take my wood ashes and I put it down the row. It's called side dressing. So that's why they just, they knew farmers side dress things. So they figured, well, it must be dressing. So it was a good guess. But like I said, they weren't country boys. They were skilled in language, but not skilled in working with nature. So one of the first things we have to recognize is when we put our garden somewhere, we've got to have enough sunlight. Okay? That's a lot of work and effort to put it in and not have enough sunlight. You have to have a minimum of 6 to 8 hours sunlight to grow vegetation. You have to have a minimum of 8 to 10 hours to grow roots, and a minimum, now these are minimums, you want more because you want better quality, a minimum of 10 to 12 hours to grow fruits. Okay, so that's the need of light. And then we have, you want to have well-drained ground. You can't have ground where you get a heavy rain and it sits. Because if it sits longer than 24 hours, you may lose all your tomato plants. They'll just all go down. So you have to have proper drainage. So your ground must have drainage. If it doesn't have drainage, you have to dig a drainage trench. And that way the water will run off and it allows you to be able to use that ground. You have to consider what trees are growing nearby. You may get, realize that when you measure the amount of sunlight, you're getting enough sunlight because you don't have obstruction south of you. Because the sun does, only in June does the sun appear to go up over us. But if you know now, the sun rises over there, goes around like this, and sets. It's in the south, shining in on an angle. Okay, and even in the summertime at the solstice, it's still coming in on an angle from the south. So you have to make sure that I have a garden up against my house that's on the north side of my house, so I have to put it back enough so in September, if I'm trying to grow something and it's being shaded because the sun has dropped as the days went on, it gets lower and lower in the horizon. I have to make sure I'm not shading it, because if I just go and say, okay, I've got plenty of sun here, and I've checked that out in June, but then the sun is dropping lower and lower each day to the south, I may be shading it through September, and if I'm growing peppers, that's when they produce fruit. So you don't want to lose your peppers that way by not. So you have to know the angle. Now, if you test the sunlight and you say, okay, I've got plenty of sunlight, and you've got a tree rather close to your garden, those roots are going to be going out into the garden. They're going to be taking everything that they can get. And so you're going to have a lot of competition and difficulty growing because of that. So you have to watch for tree roots. And then we have the parable of Jesus telling us that the seed that was thrown on the pathway didn't get a chance of germination. We'll talk about compaction a little later. And then we have the ones that grew up amongst thorns. That's good soil under the thorns, but the problem is you got shading. We'll talk about weeding and competition a little later. But then you have those that fell on stony ground. Now, it appeared as if it was good ground. The thing is, there was bedrock close to the surface. And so it just dried out after a while. You know, the dry season starts to come, the sun gets hotter and hotter in the summer. And if you only have this deep and you have bedrock, you can dry out easily. So you want to make sure that you have sufficient depth for the storage of water underneath. Okay, so, and then one other thing that I throw in, although this is garden planting, is orchards. Orchards, if you want to plant your fruit trees, you don't plant them in a flat valley. You want to have proper air drainage. They must be up on the slopes or on the top, but not right in the valley, because cold air drains. I don't know how you heat your house, but you know, the cold air drains and hot air rises. Okay, I have my wood stove at the lowest place in my split level house. 1, 2, 3 levels, actually a loft, 4 levels. The wood stove is the farthest down, lower, so that the heat will all rise. But cold air drains. So if you have windows open or something, the heat may be going up, but the cold air is draining. And I have an upland valley that I plant in, with a steep ridge on one side and a small hill on the other side, you know, maybe up 6 feet, 8 feet or so. And I have walked through the valley, and it was chilly, and put my hand up in the air, and it was warm, because all the cold air was draining off the ridge and going down. So you don't want to plant anything that can have blossoms that are frost sensitive. Okay, so those are some of the conditions for where to put your garden or your fruit tree. The next thing we want to look at here is water. Don't even consider any fertilization at all if you don't have enough water. As we're going to learn when we take a look at God's microbe population in the ground that we were given the responsibility to serve, we're going to see they don't produce the fertilizer that the plant needs unless they have sufficient water. A case in point is how many have grown tomatoes, and on the bottom of the tomato they get a black dry rot. That's called blossom end rot. And what it is if you go to the university, they'll tell you it is a calcium deficiency in the tomato. Forget it. Don't worry about that. That's their guess. I mean, that's you look at the tissue, that's what's really deficient. But why is the calcium deficient? The reason it's deficient is because boron is necessary to carry the calcium into the plant. Why is the boron deficient? Because you let the topsoil dry out. And the microbes that keep the boron available at a regular rate stop doing it. And here in New England, we do not have boron in the subsoil. Therefore, although there's moisture below the plant, we only have boron in the topsoil, because the microbes have, the ones that are air miners, have mined it out of the air and over the centuries put it in the topsoil. But that's all we have it there, because it's not naturally in the subsoil. So you let it dry out, you got no boron, you don't carry the calcium in, you get a blossom end rot. So don't let it dry out. We're going to be in irrigation here. It's very important to keep a water supply, the proper water supply that the plant needs. Now, there's some variation in water supply. And this is why one of the things you want to have for the placement of your garden is where you can have access to water. Where you can have access to water. If you don't have access to water, or say your water is chlorinated, you can still use that. It can be expensive because, that kind of water is expensive. But the chlorine is going to, as it increases, is going to give you more of a bitter taste in your food, because that's what chlorine does to food. I don't know how much you have to get, but so you want access to water so that you can have proper irrigation so you can keep your microbes working. They need a certain moisture content in the soil. Now, there are times when some things need more. They generally say an inch a week will do for most everything in the garden. But when you take raspberries, for instance, they like 3 inches a week when when they're in fruit, when they're forming fruit. As soon as they begin to flower, they begin to develop the fruit. They like 3 inches a week, and then they'll perform wonderfully. I've had raspberries and have them, you get a little rain, and they produce a raspberry, and then they quickly rot. And I'm saying to myself, why is it rotting so easily? So I quick after the rain pick my raspberries, because I know if you leave them a little longer, they're going to end up rotting. And then one year we had heavy rains in July when the raspberries were ready. And I thought, boy, we're not going to have raspberries. Best raspberries we ever had. Not a single raspberry rotted. They like 3 inches a week when they're in fruit. They like it. They like torrential rain. Another thing, too, with your onions. Onions, you got to keep them moist because they're a plant that likes moist soil. But at the last 3 weeks, if you want to size them up, you got to pour on the water. Okay? Now, there are other crops like potatoes. Potatoes, I can't recall offhand when the time to make sure you have plenty of water is, but there's a timing for potatoes. You may want to look it up. Irrigation of potatoes. And they'll tell you what that timing is, that you have to give extra water to them. So water is very important. Having the irrigation is very important. Now, if you don't have irrigation, you can mulch. One time in Arkansas, I put in some watermelon, and we didn't have irrigation. Down in Arkansas, you grow off the winter rains that have accumulated in the soil. But I put a foot of hay on them. And it rained maybe 5 days after I planted them, and never rained again. I got beautiful watermelon because I had enough mulch to keep that moisture in there, so I lost none by evaporation. Mulching is very important when you are when you don't have irrigation. You must mulch, and mulch deep. I guess, well, I'll maybe save that for a little later. So that's important there. You want to keep a record of your rain that you get. Know how much came down. Get those little things. I just put out a bucket. I always like to leave a bucket here or there standing upright, because I use buckets all the time to haul stones off, to pick stuff, to bring it to the house, and you can see how much you have. So you have an inch, a quarter inch. You'll know how much fell over the night when you were in bed and you weren't paying attention. So that you can keep an idea as to how much came naturally, and then how to give it to it. But here's something that's interesting. Remember when Elijah said, "There will be no rain nor dew until I say so." Why did he throw in dew? If a plant is properly cared for, and the microbes in the soil, you have done the service that you're to do to those microbes. The plant itself, with a dew coming in at night, will, with their leaves, grab that moisture and pull it into themselves and bring it down to the roots and keep the microbes producing. I've seen for myself, And well, Dr. Scow mentioned that, you know, in Minnesota where he was, that they didn't have rain for 2 months. But all the farms that he was servicing, where he had taught them the importance of the microbes, they didn't suffer drought. Others were getting federal assistance because of drought. But those were conventional chemical farmers that needed federal assistance because they weren't using God's design. Now, another thing that is beneficial that you can use when you're in a land, say that the prairies, or even farther west, if you're familiar with the United States, it's even drier as you go farther west until you get to the really bad deserts. Before you reach the mountains of Sierra Nevada, they go into California. And that's very dry in California too. When you don't have the irrigation, it's important to plant by the signs of the moon and the zodiac signs. Now, the zodiac signs are not the stupid stuff that they have in the newspaper that people use. They were originally for agriculture. People recognized that the different placements of the constellation, which is every 2.5 days it changes. So, matter of fact, the second book published in the United States, the Bible was the first, but when the first press was brought over from Europe, was the Farmer's Almanac, giving you those zodiac signs. And this is the reason. For the moon, when you plant, and there are certain garden plants that like to germinate at the first quarter of the moon. So you put the seeds in so they can germinate at the first quarter of the moon. And then you have those that like to germinate at the second quarter of the moon. You put those in so they can germinate at the second quarter of the moon. And then you have those that germinate at the third quarter of the moon, and those are usually your roots, because what's happening now, just like the tides pull the water up, water comes back down again. You have the moon's effect upon the soil pulling water up to the surface. And so these plants like more water up at the surface as they germinate. So you have them germinate at these different times. As the water starts to go down, the rooted plants like to chase after it and follow it down. And you don't plant anything on the fourth quarter, because that's when the water is farther enough down. But you know what you do in the fourth quarter? You go out and you hoe your garden. Now, this is in dry country, because if you disrupt the roots, it's going to be very difficult for them to get going again. But that's not for New England. New England is wet, okay? This is just for the dry areas of the world. And the same thing with the zodiac signs. There's the dry signs, then there's the wet signs. If you do something that you need it dry, then you hay. Or you cut your wood. You want your wood to dry. You want your hay to dry. You do it at those signs. They even have one for flowers. If you want better flowers, the sign of Libra. And supposedly you get better flowers. I haven't seen that it does it. I mean, I've never tried to see that it does it. But planting on those wet signs that you have there's a few of them, Aquarius, water, that for some reason or other has an effect on the seed's life so that it gets more water. Okay, how it all works, we're going to have to talk to God about that when we get to have it. Some of those things we just don't understand, but they're observable and worthy of repeating, because that's what God made this creation for us to make observation. And I might add right here, if you properly learn to observe creation, what you will see is that every single operation of every living creature is an act of service for others. What do you think our God's character is? What do you think love is? It's serving. All creation teaches us how to behave like Him. So we have now, this is a very important thing. It's called fencing. You can put a lot of effort into growing something, and the woodchucks and the rabbits and the deer will appreciate it.
And the squirrels.
Now, fencing won't keep out the squirrels and the raccoons, but it will keep out the deer and the rabbits and the woodchucks. Okay, and they're bigger eaters than the squirrels. But let me tell you, those squirrels can do a lot of damage. I lost 3/4 of my popcorn crop, and I only eat my own grain. It's the only thing I can eat is my own grain. So that's losing a lot when those things get in there and damage it. So you have fencing, and these are the things that you want in a fence: cucumbers, green beans, all beans, squashes, melons, lettuce, any of the greenery, brassicas, things like that. But I want to encourage everyone, if the reason you're growing food is so that you can get more nutrition, because you know the stuff in the supermarket is pretty anemic. It doesn't have a lot of phytonutrients because it's conventionally grown with chemicals. I mean, they just use the soil to hold the plant upright. And then they pour this chemical fertilizer on in water-soluble form, and they feed it. It's basically a form of hydroponics. The reason that the soil on the commercial lands is not producing fertilization naturally is because the chemicals that they have used for fertilizer, for pesticides, fumigants, and things like that, have wiped out the microbe populations that God designed to fertilize the plant. So, I suggest learn to eat the weeds, because the weeds can be delicious. This is how you get used to it. In the spring, I put in a garden of lettuce, arugula, cilantro, different types of lettuces, the things that you put in the salad, okay? And I didn't weed it. I just let it go. And what happened was I would eat the stuff my greenery that came up first, but as the weeds started to compete with them and beat them out, I just ate the weeds. And so I slowly increased eating the weeds with my salad until by the end of the season, my salad was not there and it was just eating weeds, and you hardly noticed the transition. Now you have plants that are vigorous on their own. I was just in the greenhouse the other day checking it out after it dropped to 9 below, and as I expected, any arugula that was sticking up or lettuce was brown. It didn't kill the plant because there was enough heat in the soil to maintain it, and it didn't stay long enough that way. But everything was browned off and just killed back. The chickweed, which I really like, it's really delicious, didn't touch a leaf. Didn't touch a leaf. And so you can have one of the cresses here. There's different types of mustards, and if you read Sister White's writing, she'll tell you right there, mustards are one of the foods that she would eat, one of the greens that she would eat. So you have these different mustards that grow wild. Shepherd's purse is one of them. Wintercress is another one. And so throw the seeds in your garden. Throw them in your greenhouse. And then as for growing greens for eating, you've got lamb's quarters. They come up naturally, and if you don't have any, get some seeds from some weed seeds, lamb's quarter weed seeds from somebody's garden, and throw them in your garden. And then amaranth. We call it red root here in New England. It's the same amaranth that they grow grain out of, just a different species. And by the way, the lamb's quarters is a chenopodium, and that species happens to be quinoa. So you can even utilize it as a grain if push comes to shove. So learn to eat your native greens. The phytonutrient level is tremendous in them. And that's one less thing you have to protect now with fencing and stuff. Now, some of the things that don't need it is garlic and onions and corn. I mean, corn for fencing, that is. You're going to have the squirrel problem. You're going to have the raccoon problem with corn, but it doesn't matter whether you have a fence or not. They climb. And one of the things also that I added here, although we're doing gardening, is grapes. The birds will like to come in, especially the early grapes, and they will just devour them. But I have used scare eye scare eyes before. And what scare eyes are, it's a beach ball. You blow up your beach ball, and it's about this size, and it has concentric circles spaced in a way that it appears like a predator's eye. And I put it up when I had some, I assume, educated crows come in and were, they're well trained to know that when the corn comes up, if they pull it out of the ground, there's a kernel of corn to eat, and they go down the row and just pull one after another after another. When I saw that one time, put up the scare eyes, didn't have a problem again. So that's something that can be used for birds if birds are a bit of a problem for you.
What you said, scare eyes?
Scare eyes, like SCARE, scare eyes. Okay, so
Does it work on blueberries?
What's that?
Does it work on blueberries with the catbirds?
Does it work?
The blueberries,
And
does it work?
blueberries. Catbirds?
We net blueberries
Oh, I haven't netted.
because they come in by the flock.
Yeah.
I mean, the only way you can grow blueberries unnetted is to plant a few acres, and then you'll get some. Okay, organic matter is a very important thing, because what organic matter is apartment houses for microbes. Okay, let's just cover the two conditions of apartment houses for microbes. As you go north, the organic matter in the soil increases. That's why you have these peat bogs up north, okay? And the peat bogs are just organic matter buildup. And organic matter gets deeper and deeper, such that in Scotland, which is, the sun is shining at 10 or 11 at night, in the daytime, I mean, they have to plow downhill to create erosion, to erode away the topsoil in order to get pine seeds to germinate in mineralized soil. Now, the farther you go south, the less and less organic matter there is, humus in the soil, in the form of humus. That's the apartment houses for these microbes that you need. So as you go south, Wisconsin, right up, touches the Canadian border or close to it there, and 4% organic matter it can hold. But you go down below Missouri, 3%. You go down to Arkansas, near Texas, you get 2%. You go down there to Mexican border or southern Florida, you get 1%. And then below that, you don't get the organic matter in the soil, because the organic material decomposes so fast that it's taken right up by the plant, and you don't get organic matter buildup. So it's very difficult for people in Florida. They have to do an awful lot of work to try to keep enough compost to grow their soil. But consider the natives of the Amazon basin. Okay? What do you think they have to do? Or Papua New Guinea, if Max is here, you grew up in Papua New Guinea, in a village in the countryside. They have learned to take, when they cut the jungle down, to char it.
To char it?
Make charcoal.
Oh,
And then they bury the charcoal in the ground. And that serves like a humus, because it is honeycombed with apartments for the microbes, just like humus is. So now you have apartments for them. And when the Europeans came over, they brought diseases with them. And in the Amazon, there was a population estimated to be about 100,000 people. 30 years later, there was only, not 100,000, 100 million. 30 years later, there was only 5 million. So the jungle grew back. And now Brazil wanted to get in on the commercial agriculture, so they cut the jungle down, and they find hundreds of years later, excellent soil. They called it terra preta, black soil. This charcoal, as microbe homes, lasts hundreds of years, and they had built their soils that way. They even added burnt clay to it to increase the paramagnetic energy flow, electrical flow of the soil. We're not going to get into that, but Sister White says in page 104 in the book Education and another book, Christ's Object Lesson, I forget what page it is here, that plants grow by electricity. And so they do. So they knew, the natives knew, how to make the homes with microbes and how to increase the electrical flow in the soil. When it comes to growing things, native folks know so much more than us educated, so-called educated people. You know, we have trashed the planet, and we have spread our green revolution all over the planet. Now we're spreading the green gene revolution all over the planet and decimating the farmlands. I just saw a video just the other day I was watching in India where the folks are saying, we're getting sick now, and we used to be able to just take these natural medicines and stuff and get better, but now we don't. And they realize it's because they switched over to the modern diet. The Green Revolution came in and taught them how to grow great quantities of rice, so they abandoned their dryland crops like millet and the different legumes that grow in the drylands on their own. Even if the rains don't come, certain ones will produce a crop. And now they're all getting sick, and they're not having a solution for their sicknesses. Whereas before, they just go get herbs and use it if they got some type of sickness. They were complaining about that, and they're going back. They're going back to the native millet there. But anyways, that's organic matter is apartments for the microbes, and in the south, as farther you go south, you want to use biochar. That's the cool name. That's the name that if you want to look it up today and learn about that, charcoal is called biochar. And people will use it up here, but I think we're far enough north that compost is sufficient to give us the, and you don't have to pay the big money for the biochar or the time to try to make it. Now, rather than get into composting and all that it takes there, I have a couple books here. How to Grow World Record Tomatoes. Charles Wilbur has the record in the Guinness Book of Record for the tallest tomato plant. I don't know. This is, it could have been broken by now because he tells everyone how to do it. So he had a cherry tomato, 28 feet. He had to build these towers to get up to them. And then he had the most amount of tomatoes he grew on 4 plants, planted 5 feet apart, 1,360 some odd pounds of tomatoes.
4 plants.
On those 4 plants. Yeah. He tells you how to make his compost. He tells you what to do to the soil, how to compost things, how to prepare it. So you get this book and you read what he said. Or the giant pumpkin growers. They got these pumpkins up to a ton. A ton. They're growing them up to a ton. I remember when they were wanting to get above 1,000 pounds. They're up to a ton now. And you can't grow them chemically. You have to grow them organically. So you get a book like this, and they'll tell you, all the things they're doing. You can glean it through the book. Charles Wilbur, he's rather accurate in detail telling you how to do it. These guys, you just listen to what they're doing, and you can grow. So this is composting. I figured might as well go to the tops in the world, see what they do, and then duplicate it the best you can on that, rather than get into composting. Now, another problem in the soil that we need to deal with is compaction. My soil was created land. It had been a peat bog. The red maple swamp was cut off. The peat was bulldozed out, sold off as topsoil, and then it was a pond. But then later my father decided, I'm going to make it a giant quarter mile track area for festivities and stuff. So he bulldozed the sides, pushed it all in. And so if you ever watch a bulldozer in operation filling in a piece of ground, he pushes the soil and leaves behind 3 or 4 inches and runs over with this 20-ton tracks. And he goes back and forth and back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, for days if he has to, or a couple of weeks if he has to build an area like I have there. And you can imagine how compacted that soil is. The roots can't get through it. Now, Sister White, when she started the school in Avondale, Australia, had that problem with the soil. People said, you can't grow stuff here. Well, the Lord gave her a dream of a angel explaining to her a plow cut in that soil and how it was good to use that soil. So she had some men coming from the Midwest where the topsoil is wonderful and things just grow easily, and telling her how the soil wasn't good. And as they're walking the farm over, they find a furrow cut just like in her dream. And she tells them, this is good soil, and this is the furrow I saw in my dream. Well, know what it took to cut that furrow? She then did it and planted her trees in that furrow. She took 16 oxen with a plow and just cut one divot with that plow. And she got down 9 inches. But that was enough to get through the compaction. And she planted her trees in it. They were able to get under it. And with time, it broke up because microbes will break through that compaction if you care for them properly. One of the roles of microbes, when we go into the microbes, is that they take minerals out of rock. I'm talking like granite. Talk about hard rock. Granite. They just take that rock, take it right apart, ship it to the plant, whatever it needs from it. This is the job of microbes. They can do all kinds of things. We'll be looking at that. So we have compaction here, and she had to get through that compaction. And you also have different conditions you may have to deal with. When she started as the school under God's design in Australia, she then came to the United States and started a school under God's design in Madison, Tennessee. And there, McGann and Sutherland were happily looking forward to the Lord guiding them to some nice fertile land. Instead, Sister White was with them too. She was with them. Her son's boat broke down on the Tennessee River. And she said, let's go ashore. They went ashore, and there was this dilapidated, rundown farm. Rocks sticking through, eroded gullies, topsoil washed away. And the Lord said, this is the farm. Madison and McGann sat down on a pile of rocks and cried, 2 grown men. But they transformed that piece of ground, understanding God's design, into a worldwide spectacle. Not only did Reader's Digest write up about this farm, the President of the United States' wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, came and visited the farm. Not only that, the Premier of China came with his wife, Chiang Kai-shek, to see what Madison had done. The Department of Agriculture came to the farm once a month to learn from them how to improve agriculture. They were experimenting. They had over 600 varieties of grapes, experimenting with different ones. Now, they were looking for disease resistance naturally. Because today, all of your fruits that you buy when you go buy a fruit tree, they don't have disease resistance. Because nobody cares about disease resistance. I got some stock from Cornell, grape stock, because I wanted black rot resistance. It's a plague in grapes. Black rot can wipe out a crop some years if it's really wet in the spring. And you get hardly any grapes that year. And I've had that happen. So I wanted black rot resistance. Well, they had, and now Cornell, by the way, is the grape depository for the Concord type grape in the world. They have all that there is there and most information on it. And so they will give you some free grape sticks to start your own grapes. So I wanted ones with black rot resistance. And they said they don't really have black rot resistance because they don't look for it. They just spray any new varieties of grapes. They do the same with apples and pears and peaches, any new variety. They do not look for resistance. So this is why we have to develop our own resistance varieties through just selectively observing what's needed, what is resistant by growing it from seed. But that's getting off the topic of gardening and getting a little more into bushes and trees and things like that, which are important for us too. Okay, so now I did want to mention here, some of you may have seen the video Back to Eden. It's about a man in Washington State who puts wood chips on all the different things that he grows. And some people, not some people, I've had a lot of people talk to me about wanting to put wood chips on their garden as a mulch. The problem with that is if your garden needs to be tilled again, because the soil isn't rich enough and you want to add amendments to it and things like that, those wood chips, undigested, are going to rob all the nitrogen and you're not going to get growth. Okay, so that's not a good idea for a garden. Excellent for blueberries, excellent for grapes, excellent for kiwis, excellent for all your fruit trees, excellent for anything woody, but not for your vegetative gardening things. Let those wood chips decompose to soil, and then you can add them as compost in your garden. Okay. Now, for creating, I didn't cover this in organic matter, but for creating organic matter, one of the fastest ways to increase the organic matter content of your soil is not with compost. It takes a while to make compost. And the volume you have to bring on is enormous. And maybe for a gardener, you can afford it. You know, buy it from somebody or something like that. You know, the municipalities have composted leaves that they will give compost away for, and it becomes rather difficult to be sure that you're not going to get some herbicides in it when you start getting stuff like that. You know, I collect leaves that people put out and use them and compost them. And sometimes when I run out of green grass clippings for a mulch, I put the leaves, and sometimes there's herbicides in it, and I can see it in the leaf, in the leaves of the tomatoes, you know. And so sometimes it's not the best, but the best way is to grow it. The best way is to grow it. And when you grow it is the latter part of your season. Your tomatoes are finishing up. Okay, some of your plants are finishing up. You come in and you put on oats. Oats will germinate in cooler weather and they'll grow up and then they'll be winter killed. But in your oats, throw in some clover too. And throw in some daikon radishes. These are cover crops. And so the importance of these cover crops is that they're continuing to feed the microbes in your soil, so you have a strong microbe population making a lot of fertilizer for you next year. And the daikon and the oats will winter kill, so you don't have to worry about trying to till them under in the spring. And I say that because if you grow winter rye, excellent cover crop, give you a lot of biomass, that's just a term for lots of stuff that's going to rot to compost and build the organic matter of your soil. They can get 7 feet tall, and they'll sure add a lot. But the thing is, have you ever tried to plow in rye in the spring? My word. My son is bought some land, and it's somewhat sloping, and then some very steep slope. And he has cleared it for gardens and orchard and all the things around there. But I told him, you get out there and put rye on it, because rye's roots are tenacious. They will hold that soil from eroding away. So they're excellent for that, but you got to have equipment to till that rye in the spring, because our roots are really, really, really tenacious. They hold that soil from eroding away. But if you use the oats instead of rye, it will winter kill and give you biomass. And the radishes will drill holes down through, and if it's not severely compacted, mine is severely compacted with a 20-ton bulldozer, and so the radishes go down as far as I've loosened the soil in the past, and boom, they hit it like a rock and don't get through. Okay, that's where you have to use Sister White's method for New England. And Sister White's method for New England was to dig trenches and then fill them in with what she called dressing, which is what we call compost. So that's one of the things that can be, that's one of the good things. And then in the spring, the clover will be alive. But if you plant a white clover and you put tomatoes in it, that's wonderful, because then the white clover, the tomatoes will grow higher. They won't be shaded by the white clover, but the white clover will provide nitrogen fertilizer for the plant and help feed it. So you increase the available nitrogen fertilizer, because on the roots of the clover are rhizobium bacteria that make nitrogen available. You see, it's that soil, and that's where the fertilization goes on. Yes?
What about flax for nitrogen?
What kind of nitrogen?
What about flax?
Flax?
Flax, where we get flaxseed?
Flaxseed? I haven't.
That's excellent for nitrogen.
Okay,
Is it?
maybe so. I haven't heard, but I say maybe so on purpose, because when I first started gardening, say 50 years ago or something like that, the only thing that made nitrogen available was clover. But the more they began to study the microbiome of the soil, they're finding all kinds of plants make clover, make nitrogen. And it's very obvious when I walk through, I'm just walking my farm over, and there's grass, clumps of grass. You'll see one species of grass nice and green, or another species of grass right alongside of it, within 8 inches. It's not nice and green. And the reason is that grass fixes nitrogen. It is feeding nitrogen-fixing microbes. You see, these microbes in the soil, they can't live without being fed by the plants. See, it's a service, a mutualistic service. It's called mutualistic symbiosis, which is nothing more. The plants serve them the carbs they need, because they take sunlight and they take water and CO2, and they make all the sugars, all the carbohydrates, the energy that all these critters in the soil need, and then they in turn go mine the soil and manufacture stuff from the soil and give it to the plant. So you get this feeding operation going on. It can get quite detailed, and so that's okay. Got to make sure I have enough time. It looks like we'll have plenty of time. Another thing is adaptive varieties. That's obvious when you're trying to buy fruit trees and bushes and that kind of stuff, because they will have what zone it's good to. And we're in zone 5, so you'd want something that can grow in zone 5. You wouldn't want to take your zone 7 and grow it here. You can maybe get away with a zone 6 for a few years, maybe even several. Then you're going to get that 1 year where it's a zone 5, and you're going to kill that. You're going to lose your plant. Okay, so you want to plant your fruit trees and fruit bushes, and that's according to the zone that they're in. I have some blackberries, thornless blackberries, that I got from someone who would come to these classes that we have here, and that thornless blackberry grows here. Now I planted a half dozen thornless blackberries, and they can't grow. They can't take it. Now there are thorny blackberries that will grow all the way up into Maine, where it's even colder. But I didn't want thorns. I wanted some of the thornless. And every so often, maybe half the plants would be killed back. Some years, almost nothing killed back, but usually something is killed back to some level because it's on the edge of this zone. It can just barely take it. So zonation is important for varieties being adapted to your area. Now, when we're in the garden, one of the things you want to do is trial varieties. For instance, I wanted to see what were the best beets to grow, and because I didn't like beets, they sort of taste like dirt. And but I grew a half dozen varieties, and I found that the Chayoga was sweet. I said, that's nice. That's the one that looks like a candy cane on the inside, except the concentric circle, white, red, white, red. That's a Chayoga. And then the orangish beet, I forget its name, but it's a nice sweet one. They were both sweet, but that one didn't grow that good here. But the Chayoga grew well and was sweet, and so you plant a number of varieties. If there's something you like, plant several varieties, and then test them, and see how they are. The purpose of growing food is for nutrition, and we all have a tool for measuring nutritional content, and that's called our tongue. Our tongue can measure sugar content. And when there's an increase in sugar content, there's an increase in nutritional content. The mineral content goes up in direct ratio to that sugar content. And it's the mineral content that's necessary for the formation of the phytonutrients that are going to be in your plant. So that's a way to test. So you can test your food, and whichever one tastes the best, that's the one. And if your neighbor does the same thing as you, grows the same things as you, and he said, this one tastes better for me than this one that tastes better for you, that's because their body's needs are different. So not only are you testing for higher nutrient value, you're testing for odds and end nutrients that you may need that your neighbor may not need. So grow different varieties, select the ones that taste the best for you, and grow them for yourself. Now you have to adapt to climates. Some things like it wet, some things like it dry. And you can't grow the stuff that's dry, especially in New England where it's overly wet. They're not going to perform well. Okay? And then the same thing the other way around. If it's, for instance, with cold and heat, the cabbage family. I've tried to put broccoli in the spring, and the variety I grew was not fast enough to give me a crop before it warmed up. And once it warmed up, the broccoli said, forget it, I'm not doing nothing. And it sits there all summer long. And then when it cools down, then the broccoli takes off and starts producing. Because it only likes cool weather to grow well in. Okay? I have kale that we grow in the spring, and it's nice. But then when it tries to come across the summer, most of it goes down. It just goes down and rots. No good, because it's not the climate for it. Start some again in July, and then put these young plants in around the beginning of August, because that's when biennials begin to grow. A biennial is a plant that grows its first vegetative phase of growth in the fall. It overwinters, and then it shoots up a flower stalk in the spring and late spring, and then seeds and grows again in the fall. So the vegetative stage is the fall growing, and it doesn't like to grow in the summer. It just seeds in the summertime, goes to seed and whatnot. So these plants that like the cool weather are usually biennials. And so this is the way it is. And when I say your broccoli, I'm speaking of the what people will call brassicas, which include your all the cabbage. They say family. They're all variations of one species. You've got cabbage, kale, collards, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi. They are all the same species, just selected over time for different characteristics. But they all like the cooler weather. So my son, where it went down to 30 below, he can grow them through the summer. Obviously, summer is not as warm as we have here where it doesn't get that cold. So he can grow them well through the summer. So they're an important crop for him. So we have the heat and the cold and the wet and the dry, and that determines. Then we have some things like light. Light can determine what variety to grow. Okay? There are short day and long day onions and intermediate day onions. And the onions that I grow are candy onion, and they ripen in July. But they ripen according to the fact that now, in July, they've just passed the solstice, summer solstice, and now the days are getting shorter. As soon as the days get shorter, onions say, time to quit. They don't care what size they are. You put them in early enough, and you will have a long growing season, provided it's not too early that they get whacked with frost or freeze. I've had that happen. And they will grow, and they will size up and give you, candy onions can get like that. And so, but if you take that same candy onion seedling or onion bulbs, how people put in onion bulbs, they buy the onion bulbs, and you put them in June, doesn't matter. It's not going to grow the whole length. Say it grew, you put them in April, you got half of April, you got May, June, and half of July. So you got three months worth of growing time. You put it in June, it's going to stop growing in July because it's oriented to day length. So when you have varieties that are day length oriented, you have to consider that. So that's why you get your onions in early. Let's see. So we did the trial and error there. You want to try different varieties. I've already mentioned that, but I'm going to say it again. When I was in Wisconsin, one of the really good tasting tomatoes was called the Wisconsin 55. Notice it was named Wisconsin. We brought it to Connecticut, planted it, didn't taste good at all. Okay? And so that was climatically adapted, and Connecticut didn't have that climate. So you try varieties and that are adapted. Now here's something to recognize the importance of. We talked about seed saving last time, but I just want to mention a little bit about it. 2 weeks ago we had that class, and that is that when you save your own seed, it adapts to your climate. And when you buy seed to start your gardens with, you don't know where on planet Earth they came from. China produces an awful lot of seed. So many countries of Europe and different areas of the world, Africa and whatever, you got commercial growers growing seed. And then they sell it on the seed market, and you buy this seed. And it could be adapted to those climates. So you want to maintain it growing in your climate because it will adapt itself year after year. This is called epigenetics. This is the capability of the genes to alter themselves because they read the climate. Genes were designed by God to take a readout on the environment around them. Hot, cold, length of all the different they take a
Right.
readout on the environment, and then they change. They change their genes to adapt to the climate. I just read an article this morning about weeds adapting themselves to herbicides. And not only adapting themselves to herbicide, but now they're fearful that these particular native plants
Helping them grow.
that are
it.
becoming weeds because they have resistance to the herbicide, they're breeding back into the native population and giving herbicide resistance to the native population. And the thing is, that herbicide resistance to the native population is going to make them unfit to live in a native environment, and they start to jeopardize the native plants and start killing them off because they have adapted to the herbicides. Okay, so adaptive varieties you want to create yourself by saving your own seed and by selecting initially by buying a bunch of different beets or a bunch of different carrots or a bunch of different tomatoes, and then saving the best of those varieties to grow for you. Okay. Now, for the right time here to plant, if you're from around here, we made this chart here. This is called Planting Instructions for Southern Connecticut and Connecticut River Valley. Connecticut River Valley has a southern Connecticut climate that stretches all the way up into Massachusetts. So if you want a copy of this, you just email, if you want to take this down, if you want to copy this, because this gives all the planting times for this area that we're in. Some of you, if you've been here before, have gotten a copy of this. But if you want it, it's you just email to room, ROOM 501 PRS at yahoo.com. Want me to do that again? ROOM 501 PRS at yahoo.com. And you will be sent a copy of this that you can either keep on your computer or download and put on the paper form. Because it's handy to have this out there, because you're working in the garden and, and this gives you what to put in according to the season. It starts in February when I first put stuff in the greenhouse, and then in mid-March when I start to put things outside, like my peas and stuff.
Is your greenhouse heated?
And what's that?
Is your greenhouse heated?
No, only by the sun. Only by the sun. February 10th is my day that. The reason I pick February 10th is because it warms up enough. I used to prune out of doors, and at February 10th is when I would start to sunburn because I'm fair skinned, and I would burn out there on those clear days. But all winter long, I wouldn't burn because the sun was too low in the heights and on the horizon. But when it got to that point, I'd start to burn, and that's a lot of heat coming in. And so the greenhouse, even though it's not heated, would actually be able to handle putting the seeds in. I put the seed in, may take 2 weeks to germinate because it is, cold at night still at that time. But then I'd have my kale coming up, lettuce and arugula and cilantro and all that hardy stuff that can take a frost.
It was 90 in my greenhouse.
What's that?
It was 90 in my greenhouse on Saturday.
Yeah, well, I know. We have not had winter yet this year.
Warm winter.
So this also has, and then it tells you what to plant in mid-May and the second and third week, mid-April, the second and third week of April, end of April. And it gives you all the different plants to plant at those different times, so you'll know what to put in at the right time. And you go right, and then it gives a lot of gardening instruction, care of the garden, care of the plants, a lot of just information we added to here that's beneficial. Okay, so you can take a look at that. Now, I wanted to talk to you about something that has been recently discovered by the Western world from, of course, the intelligent native people. And that is in Madagascar, a Jesuit priest with a good heart went there to try to help the people. And after 7 years, he concluded, I'm a total failure. I haven't done anything for these people. Well, it bothered him, and so he got up from wherever he was and started traveling around Madagascar and learned some practices that were new, that had happened, and she started sharing this until finally it came to the attention of some scientists from Cornell, and then they brought it back and trialed it for a few years and said, man, this really works. And what it was called system of rice intensification. It was what was observed by the folks. Now, when you put your rice in the ground in areas of the world where you have monsoons or seasonal rains that come in, you have a timing schedule, torrential rains, and it's not the time to be out there getting stuff in. You want to get your things in the ground so that they can take advantage of the rains and stuff. So they had a system of planting rice that everyone was using. And the system was that you would take the rice and you would grow it 20 to 30 days in a bed. Don't write this down. This is all wrong. But this is what everyone was doing. Because when they switched to this new method, they increased production 50, 100, 150% out of nowhere. So 20 to 30 days, then they transplant it out, and they would not just take one plant, but, grab some plants, and I know how simple that is because starting celery seed, I soak it, and parsley seed, I soak it, and they clump together. But you spread them out in the soil, and they begin, and so you get a clump up, and it's so easy just to grab a little clump of young celery and put it in. And so they would do this with the rice plants, a little bit of a clump there, a few plants together. And they would want to plant it closer together because they wanted to make sure they utilize all the space to get the best production. Well, one time they started some plants. The rains were going to come early, and they didn't have enough plants. So they said, what are we going to do? They said, well, let's just plant. So they just used one rice plant. They gave it extra spacing. And what happened was the plants tillered. That's a characteristic of the grass family. Because they had the spacing, instead of just growing one or two stalks from that clump there, or just a few there competing with each other, each plant was able to get all the full potential that it needed because now they were spaced farther apart, and they increased the yield by 50 to 100% by doing that. And another thing they learned too was that instead of growing the rice in flooded rice paddies, they would let the rice paddy dry out and then give it rain, give it water, and let it dry out. And using this method, they tremendously increased the rice production. And so this is what they were doing. They were growing the rice plants. Now, I'm telling you this because what has developed from it is what is called a system of crop intensification. So many crops can be grown using these same methods. They grew the rice only for 8 to 12 days, not 20 to 30. Very young plant. Spaced it good and wide. It was 25 centimeters. Whereas, they'd been putting it like that before, but instead they gave it the room that it needed. And they, of course, used the compost because they already knew to use compost as a fertilizer for it. And then they used the watering method of letting it dry out instead of just keeping it flooded. They flooded it to get it going, but then they let it dry out again. And this tremendously increased production. So this is when you're growing plants for transplant, we all grow tomatoes, and peppers, and eggplant, and on and on, and and then we transplant them out. Um, when you grow them, don't let them hit the edge of the containers. Don't let the roots hit the edge of the containers. And in many cases, you have to plant them later, because if you start your tomatoes early and it's not warm enough to put them out, because you may get hit with frost, they're hitting the edge of the containers. Well, when they hit the edge of the containers, environmentally, what do? Okay? They epigenetically alter their growth to the soil that they have to grow in, and the container tells them how much they have to grow in, and they dwarf themselves. They produce smaller. Now you take them later, and other roots go out and they grow, but you have already established a dwarfing characteristic in there, and you're going to have a reduction in yield. It's actually better to start them in trays with no container size, and then let these little plants. If one root wants to go 6 inches in a tray, it can go it, because you got these trays like this, And so when you transplant them out, they haven't hit any wall. So now you're going to get them to utilize their full potential and grow. So this is basically what they were doing, is transplanting them at an early stage. You would not let them get crowded in the growing bed, and then they would transplant them out and give them the space they needed. Which, when I recognize this, I'm going to space my corn farther apart. And because I space my corn according to, they normally produce 1 ear, so I space it apart so that all my 1 ears fill out to the top. But they always don't fill out perfectly with the best kernels on the top. So actually I'm getting a reduction in nutrients in my kernels, because I'm just giving them just enough space to fill out that 1 ear. But where some of the plants had died and they have more space, that ear is filled out to the top, and every kernel on top is as round as the other ones. And you know how you go buy an ear of corn, you're going to eat it, and some of the top kernels are smaller than the other kernel. It ran out of energy, didn't get the full potential. So now you get a lot more quality. So you increase the quality by doing that, but you can actually also increase the volume of production per acre in using some of these grass crops here. So you use the composting, you give them the space they need. They are applying this to the raising of animals too. They call it give the pig the pigness of the pig, and the chickenness of the chicken. In other words, you give them the environment they like, and they will perform much better and give you much better quality. Not that I'm encouraging meat eating or anything like that, but this applies to all of your planting. Now, spacing is something you're going to have to learn according to your soil. When I attempted to see what spacing I should use, I was using for my tomato plants in cages. My cages were about 2 foot apart, and so 24 inches. So I like to tie one to the other in a row, and then I had to use less stakes to stake them up. But then as I'm learning spacing is important for quality and volume, I put them farther apart, and I put them extra far apart, and I learned what spacing would give me full potential for that plant. So you're going to have to learn spacing. That's going to be something you're going to have to do. And you're going to have to do that quality, using your tongue, and, learning, well, don't go too far. I mean, you can go too far, and you have wasted space, So you're going to have to learn what that is yourself. And then, of course, weed competition, you don't want to give them any space. You want, in almost all cases, you don't want to give them any space, because you don't want them taking the nutrients. And so I just mulch. But there are a few cases where one tall weed for a plant is beneficial. A patch of cucumbers, and I grow a couple patches of them because we make pickled cukes, half sour pickles for sale. So I need a lot. And to have an occasional, say, red root, amaranth growing there, shading, because it can get tall. Mine grow 9 feet in the garden. That occasional shade in the patch benefits the cucumbers. You can also take sunflowers and run it, put them 8 feet apart down a cucumber patch. So to give that occasional sunlight. I rip some of the bottom leaves off because they will shade some of the plants around it and leave the rest of them because I'm growing cukes. Not really caring about the seeds up top because the birds are going to get them anyways.
Did you say sunflower 8 feet apart?
Yes, in your cucumber patch.
Oh, okay.
Because you're growing it for shade. But if you harvest the heads properly and feed the
Sunflower
birds,
seeds.
you can and dry them down because they'll tend to rot unless you dry them down well and quickly. You can utilize that as seeds to eat. Now, because many soils are damaged, inoculating your seed before you plant it is important. And it's very beneficial and increases production. Now, here's Fedco Seeds and Supplies. This is out of Maine, and I use this catalog here. I use this catalog because we're in New England like Maine, although they're a little far north of us. And it has a section called Inoculants and Probiotics. Okay, and in these inoculants, for instance, legumes, you always want to inoculate them with a legume inoculant. It could be a pea, bean inoculant. And once you do it and you maintain cover crop over that, those inoculants will stay living to be there next year.
What's an inoculant?
Okay. Now an inoculant is microbes. They give you a little package of dust, and you take your seeds when you're going to plant them in a can, pour a little bit of the dust in there, and then a couple drops of water, just so they get enough moisture and then you shake the can up, and you'll see the black powder is on the bean seed. When you buy seed, say from an organic seed company, and they're organic seeds, those seeds come pre-inoculated by the mother plant. You know how mothers inoculate their babies with the microbiome in your gut. The microbes in your gut are what maintain the health of your immune system. And if you take antibiotics, you slaughter them. And you know what the most common antibiotic used on planet Earth today is? Roundup. So where they use Roundup herbicide, they're slaughtering the microbiome. Okay? So as a mother inoculates the baby at birth, when it comes out of the birth canal, so too does the mother plant inoculate the seed if it's organically grown. And it will have in it what it needs. So that's the way you have to set up with your seed. Yes?
Where are some of the best places to get those organic seeds?
The organic seeds, High Mowing is a catalog that sort of specializes in organic seed. Fedco that I gave you here has a lot of organic seeds.
What about any seeds?
If they're not inoculated, you mean if they're conventionally grown?
Yeah.
You would want to inoculate them. Okay? I mean, if that's all you can get, because,
Where do you get the inoculants?
right, it's in the section called Inoculants and Probiotics in Fedco. See that? Inoculants and Probiotics.
So you can order it from them?
Yes, and I want to tell you something. Get these inoculants this year and put them on your seed, because I opened this catalog up and was just reading it before this class, and I realized it says here, for soybean, peas, veg, lentils, dry beans, peanut varieties dropped by the supplier, we are looking for a replacement inoculant. Then I read a couple other places, inoculants that were here last year are no longer available.
Why?
Those that do not want you growing your own food are buying these companies up and closing them down. I had some friends that were scrapping out a sawmill down in Texas for scrap. This sawmill cost, I don't know if it was $100 million or $200 million to build, but because they don't want us to have lumber anymore, you know how they're burning the lumber yards down all over North America? They bought that lumber yard, that mill for $200 million and then destroyed it. Destroyed it. And they're scrapping it out and getting stuff from it. This is what's going on in the country. We have the very wealthy on the planet have so much money that they're going to buy everything in Western Europe and North America, because we protested, us Protestants, protested against the papacy. So the merchants of the earth and the kings of the earth, with all their control and finances, are going to pay us back. We're getting payback. Now, they plan to reduce our population by 2/3 within a decade or so. I don't know quite what their plan was. Professor V talked about it, because you can read it. They're open about it. You know. Okay, so we want to get these inoculants. We want to get them in the soil, and we want to be planting cover crops, because we want to feed, not only build up the topsoil with the cover crop, but continue to feed these microbes in the soil so we can have them making the free fertilizer for us. Now, sometimes it's good to add what are called fertilizers in the form of rock dusts. You know, like lime is a rock dust, and phosphate rock dust could be in a clay form. Aragonite is one. Green sand is another one. And these can provide nutrients. And this has been the common method of fertilization all my life, for a century. But now that we're learning the role of microbes, we need to be working with God's design. Now, at this point, I think I will, I have one more thing before I go into the microbes, and that is rest the ground on the 7th year. If you rest your ground on the 7th year, and the way to do that is don't go without eating on the 7th year. Whenever you started, section it off. I have a number of gardens. My farm, if you want to call it that. We call it that because that's how we get tax reduction. Is, sell some and then you get a tax reduction. Instead of paying over $5,000 on taxes, I don't know what it is now, but that's what it would have been. We get a reduction down to only $300 a year taxes on that land because we have a farm. We've sold something. That's the way it is in Connecticut. That's the way it is in Meriden, Connecticut. In Wallingford, next to me, the town over, it's 0 taxes for the farmland. Of course, the farmer's house is sectioned off on 1 acre, and he pays taxes for his house, but the rest of it is 0 because they want to maintain the farmland. So, rest it on the 7th year, and what will happen is that the weeds that come up, the plants that come up, will readjust the soil. They will come up the ones that are the most useful in repairing the soil, because all weeds are repairers of soil. God designed all the weeds to have different jobs of repairing the soil. The big tall ones, biomass. That is a lot of stuff to rot and make topsoil. Others, like the oats, when you use them, they don't have as much biomass as the rye, but they have some. But they're good for pulling up phosphate and making phosphate available. An important fertilizer. You have your daikon radishes. Not only do they help attempt to bore holes in the soil if it's not too compacted, extremely compacted with a bulldozer, they will pull up sulfur and other nutrients and bring them up into the growing area of the soil because they have a taproot that can go way down, 5-6 feet more, you know. If you grow something like alfalfa has been measured to go down 60 feet. So these things draw nutrients up to the surface, and so the weeds draw nutrition up, and they readjust the microbiome and the fertilization that you're going to have the next year. So weeds, it's very important to let God have it on the 7th year. He will grow what he wants to grow on it.
So even on the 7th year, you plant the nutrients?
Oh, I forgot to mention the reason I broke mine up into different portions was because for instance, this year I have kiwi in the field and I have kiwi at my house. The ones in the house, they're resting, not the one in the field. So I have both kiwi. Then I have a tomato patch. Half the tomato patch is resting. So I'm going to put tomatoes between the grapes to keep the same volume I have. I have also the greenhouse. I split it down the middle. I'm resting one half, and I'm going to rest the other half at another, probably next year.
My big garden.
And I have all my gardens sectioned out, and I have a whole list of what year they rest on. So every year I go over my list and say, okay, this is going to be rested this year. And I've tried to break it all up so that I don't not have something to grow. This is Sister White's advice in counsel to students and teachers, I think it was. One of the pages there, she says to do it in portions. Rest it in portions, and then change the crop, she said.
I garden, and I've been in the house 7 years, and I planted there every year 7 years. So my job was this year I'm about to rest my big garden. I do have a small one that wasn't planted for 7 years.
Uh-huh.
But so do you add the clover and the radishes to the garden when it's resting, or do you just let it do whatever?
This is what I do, except for garlic, because garlic I plant in the fall. It's the only thing I plant in the fall. So I do it from fall to fall, 1 year. But most of everything is planted in the spring. So I plant everything that I would plant in that year. Then the next year I don't touch it. And I will put my cover crops on in the fall, let them go. I mean, I had rye on an area that I rested last year, and it just grew to 7 feet, fell down, collapsed, started coming up again this year, but now this year I'll have to work with that piece of ground. So I just, if that's part of your grow, whatever is part of your growing schedule. Sometimes you have cover crops in the spring. For instance, some of the corn that I'm going to plant, you plant the sweet corn, every 2 weeks so that you get sweet corn coming in at different times. The later plantings that are coming in July, that's enough time for me to plant oats in the spring. And then I can knock down the oats and till it under and plant the corn. And so, and that's a cover crop that will help build up the soil. So whatever you do in that year, do it in that year. But the next year, don't do anything. It's the Lord's. It's His. He'll manage it.
Do you put compost in it still?
It's His.
Nothing.
It's His. It's His. It's His. Yeah. Many people want to do things on the year of rest. They want to help the Lord. I don't think He needs help. I think He knows more than we know, and we just haven't learned it yet. So, okay, got a few more minutes. I just wanted to cover how plants grow. Now, they're fed by microbes, and I told you how important it is to have a home for them, okay? And that's why we have the organic matter, for them to have homes in. In the soil, you have what are called mycorrhizal fungi. Now, this is in soil that you haven't slaughtered them in with chemicals or by tilling, by deep plowing, by plowing. It's all right to till the surface and remove weeds with a hoe or whatever. That's fine. But when you start tilling down deep, you slaughter the mycorrhizal fungi because they have networks that grow out from the roots. And those networks that go out increase the nutrient uptake of the roots hundreds to as much as 1,000 times. They go out and they will mine minerals from rock. And when I say go out, they have a highway system from the very root out into the soil, a highway system with internet. And they receive, it may seem funny, but they tested it. 10 miles in an unbroken forest. The mycorrhizal fungi, untouched, no logging roads through it. 1 second, split second later, they pick up the signal from the impulse they put in the ground. They have internet, and they use it because the plant orders how much it needs. When a plant is growing vegetatively, it doesn't need a lot of nutrients. But when it goes into flowering, reproduction, just like moms, what they do, they lose the minerals from their teeth that they don't get enough, okay? So they order much more. It can be up to 50 times more. And they give that order to the mycorrhizal fungi. They go out and they mine the nutrients that are needed. And along their highways, they have colonies of bacteria manufacturing phytonutrients. And they feed these colonies because these fungi, they don't produce their own energy sources, nor do many of these bacterial colonies. The energy source is made by the plant taking sunlight and taking water and CO2 and making carbs, sugars. And they exude it into the soil. When they first recognized this, they called it leaky roots. Why are the roots leaking sugars into the soil? Only to find out they were feeding vast microbiome that lives around the roots that do all kinds of work. So they go out and they carry the nutrients to the manufacturing plants, bacterial colonies manufacturing these different phytonutrients, carry it back to the plant. And that's why it's important to maintain this, because our foods today don't have the phytonutrients in them that are grown from sterile soil where they use antibiotics like Roundup herbicide and chemical fertilizers that slaughter the microbiome. So we want to protect it. So deep plowing to break up the hard pan must be done when you're first getting onto a piece of ground, like Ellen White did. But once you broke through it, then you let the plants do their work. And if you properly care for them, they will maintain that, and you'll never have hard pan again. It's only bad agricultural practices that increase hard pan. Yes?
What's considered deep?
What's that?
What's considered deep? You said deep.
How deep is deep?
Deep, if you're properly weeding between your rows, what you will do is go out and weed with a scuffle hoe, because it's you cut pushing and you cut pulling. It's like a stirrup saddle, and so you do that every 2 weeks. And for me, I wear glasses, and even with glasses I can hardly see the weeds in 2 weeks. But if you get down, you'll see there are thousands of them all coming up. Okay? So if you do it every 2 weeks, the plants, and you do it 3 times, the plants will get big enough. Your beans, your corn, these are row crops, and they will shade them out. And what does begin to grow after that just will languish. It won't be a competitor with the crop. Okay? So how much do you need to, you don't need much. You just scuffle. And you keep the weeds out. Okay? So you don't want to break up this network because it's providing enormous amounts of nutrients to the plant via these bacterial colonies. And then again, too, we have around the plant itself colonies that are just they're in the organic matter. We're talking microscopic. We're talking very microscopic. We're talking if they didn't have the high-powered microscopes that finally came out. My friend of mine happened to work with some of the first people using these microscopes to study the microbiome, and he said, we looked at it for the first time, and this was in the early 1980s. Just began to understand and learn about this. They could actually see that small. I don't know what they're doing now, but now what they have learned is they've renamed the whole fungus kingdom now because there's so many of them in the soil, and they are not classifying them anymore according to their shape, just like the classification of the flowering plants of the world is all based upon the shapes of the different flowers. Okay, they first classified them according to the shape: rod-shaped bacteria, spherical bacteria, that kind of stuff that they could see. They classify them now according to the chemicals they produce, and so now they have vast amounts of different species producing all kinds of different chemicals. These chemicals are all necessary for us to have a power-packed food to eat. That term phytonutrient, phyto meaning plant, nutrients, that comes from how well the soil is kept, because those constituents that make up the plant nutrient that we eat comes from these microbes. And here's another thing that's important too. As a fertilizer, using seed products is phenomenal. The scientists will tell you that a plant only has in its tissue maybe 30 different elements. That's not significant for a plant to be healthy because the microbes use all the elements. And so getting seaweed from the ocean, where all the elements have washed down in there, and using that as a product on your landscape. I'm taking rides down to the seacoast now and coming back with truckloads of seaweed. This provides the minerals for these microbes. The plant doesn't have those minerals in the tissue, but the microbes need minerals that the plants don't need in order to make the phytonutrients that we need in our diet. So it's very important to have these. What has just been learned in the last couple years is that what is called rhizophagy. And there's a sort of a picture of it here, and here's a diagram here. This is in Acres USA, an excellent magazine to get, an excellent magazine. Acres USA. And this diagram shows that this area here at the tip of the root is exuding nutrients into the soil, and it can be wider than that. And it attracts microbes to live in that zone and set up housekeeping. The mycorrhizal fungi go out from that zone. This is where they're fed. Some of the mycorrhizal fungi just come into this zone and are fed. Others actually go into the cell of the plant and are fed on the inside, and then they go out. But what they are just now learning is that in this zone here, rhizophagy means rhizo for root, a rhizome is a root. Phagy means to engulf. These roots engulf microbes and take them into themselves, and then they dissolve the coating of the microbe, the bacteria, and with no covering, it then releases its stores of nutrients. And then when it's released its stores of nutrients, they are hastened out, these root hairs out the side, back into the soil, where they again take up nutrients and come back in. And some of these microbes are carried all the way up through the plant, through the stem, through the leaves, into the flowering parts, where they go into the cells. We're talking bacteria now. They go into the cells and there release what they have for the plant. Now, I rather suspect, although I haven't heard research on it yet, but I know somebody must be doing it, is that not only does the plant exude carbohydrate nutrition, simple sugars, into the soil to feed these vast microbe colonies, the microbiome that surrounds plant roots, but they also exude it out onto the leaf surface, where they feed vast colonies of microbes and bacteria and yeast. Remember, what do you do if you're on a vegan diet and supposedly can't get enough B12 in your diet? You can use yeast, right? Because yeast have B12, right? Well, you don't have to worry about B12. Anyone that's a vegan and only eats plants, if you eat the plants right from your garden, because the entire surface of the plant is covered with yeast. One of the things that are being fed, and I rather suspect, but I haven't heard it yet, that they take in microbes from the leaf, bacteria from the leaf into the leaf, and there do the same thing they do in the roots, you know. Okay, so that pretty much concludes what we're going to present today. One more thing I want to add is I also brought this book with me, and it's called The Way to Ultra Low Cost Agriculture, and it's written by a Korean organization, and what they teach here, and it would be something good to know since there's another place in the inoculant section that I gave you here also, not here this year, there's no inoculant. Koreans have learned to grow their own inoculants, and they will teach you how to grow your own inoculants, all different types of inoculants, all different types of microbes to be added to your soil. So this is a very good book to learn to do it yourself. Okay, that concludes it, and let's have prayer, and then we'll have questions if there are any. Lord, we want to thank you. You have a wonderful design for us. You had planned for us to be in tip-top shape and health. But Lord, we thought we were wiser. We thought we were wiser than you and the way you design creation. Lord, help us to get back to it. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.